Prime Minister Justin Trudeau welcomed France's new Prime Minister to Parliament Hill today. It's Gabriel Attal's first international trip outside of Europe since landing this high-profile job. French President Emmanuel Macron appointed Attal to the role of Prime Minister in January. It's the second highest office in France, and the appointment was historic. At 35, Attal is France's youngest prime minister ever, and he is the country's first openly gay head of government. He is viewed as Macron's potential successor in the 2027 presidential election. But before that, he has to help Macron and his party fend off the rise of Marine Le Pen and her far-right party in upcoming European elections. While in Ottawa, Attal and Trudeau announced plans to strengthen bilateral cooperation on fighting wildfires and joint action on climate change. I sat down with the French Prime Minister this morning for an exclusive CBC News interview. Prime Minister, welcome to Canada. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. This, as I understand it, is your first international trip outside of Europe. Why Canada? What are you hoping to accomplish on this visit?
It is my first trip abroad the EU since I was appointed Prime Minister. And I really wanted to do this trip in Canada because Canada is such a strong friend, a strong ally, a strong partner for France. You know, we are the two only countries that are both in G7, G20, NATO, and Francophonie organization. We share some common values, the freedom, progress, and democracy. And so it was very important for me to be here in Canada to handle some very important issues, such as the fight against climate change or Francophonie. And I'm very happy to be here.
On climate change, there's been pushback in this country on the use of carbon pricing as a mechanism to deal with emissions, reduce emissions, and to fight climate change. Is that part of your conversations with Prime Minister Trudeau? And what do you say to people who are skeptical of pricing as a way to deal with this?
Well, there are decisions which are internal decisions. But I think what is important is that both France and Canada, we share a roadmap for the fight against climate change, biodiversity, oceans. And so we will sign with Prime Minister Trudeau an agreement, a very important agreement, which handles some parts of, the President Macron initiative, the 4P initiative, Partnership for People and the Planet. And so I think we will move forward on that. And then, in every country, the transition is difficult. We in France had these debates about climate carbon pricing, and it's a difficult issue. But for our generation, it's, I think, the biggest challenge we have.
Well, you have common values and common goals in alignment with Canada, but also common unfinished business when it comes to trade, because there's the challenge now with getting the final ratification of the Canada-Europe trade agreement. Farmers in your country and across Europe are pushing back on this. Your Senate just voted against ratifying it. Is France turning against this deal?
No, I don't think so. It's a good deal, and it's a win-win deal. I think it's been signed 6 years ago, and since then, our trade exchanges raised by more than 30%. And so it's a good deal both for Canada and for France. Figures don't lie. The National Assembly in France ratified the deal. And the Senate, where we don't have, the majority, President Macron and us, decided to block it. I think for political reasons, because there are the European elections coming. So I think we will give time to time. The agreement still applies, and I'm quite confident in convincing all MPs that it's a good deal for France and for Canada, but also for France and for French farmers as well. The revenue for French farmers by trade with Canada raised also and increased. So we will show, I think, that it's a good deal for France.
The argument from a lot of farmers, as I understand it, is the environmental regulations on this side of the ocean are lower and make your farmers less competitive. But the defeat in the Senate, political or not, was significant. 211 against, just 44 in favor. With that kind of an opposition, how do you get CETA over the finish line?
We have two chambers in the French Parliament, National Assembly and the Senate. We don't have the majority at the Senate, but in the end, many of our bills still pass in the Parliament because we have the the majority, relative majority at the National Assembly. But regarding environmental issues in the deal, what is important for French farmers is that we have standards here in Canada on farmers as well, and so we don't import some goods with lower standards than the goods that are made and produced by French farmers. And we have this security in the CETA deal. And we don't have this security in the Mercosur deal, which is negotiated by the EU with the South American countries. That's why we blocked the Mercosur deal. So when a deal is not good for trade and for French people, French farmer, we block it. But the CETA deal is a good deal both for France and for Canada.
This trade skepticism or resistance, though, you mentioned the European elections. This is all sort of happening at a time when Marine Le Pen and her party are at high watermarks in terms of popularity. And we're seeing this sort of movement across Western countries, sort of against incumbency, against multilateralism, against freer trade as people embrace populism. Is there a connection between the seat of resistance and those political forces, and how do you navigate that as a government?
I'm not sure there's a connection, but we see in every European country that populists and far-right movements are rising. And I think we must be very careful about that. But I'm convinced that French citizens and citizens all across the EU know that with all the challenges we're facing, the return of the war in Europe, climate change, and many other challenges, we need to stand together and we need to work as European Union and with allies to tackle and to handle them. And that's not what populists and far-right movements are bearing.
But yet people seem to be embracing it, right? We've seen what happened in the Netherlands with Geert Wilders, and we do see this increase. The specter of Donald Trump looms in the United States. There are shifts in German politics. It's sort of like a post-COVID surge in a certain direction. How do you push back against it in France? How do you push back against it?
But post-COVID, there was a presidential election in France in 2022, and President Macron was elected against Marine Le Pen and against far-right movement, the Rassemblement National. So I committed in politics because I think we can change things, and also because I think that the polls don't. What is important is are the votes, and we must convince French citizens to vote for a pro-European Union candidate, which is the candidate I support in the European elections.
You mentioned President Macron defeating Marine Le Pen in 2022. He can't run again in 2027 because he is term limited by our Constitution. A lot of people point to you as a possible successor to President Macron. Will we see you potentially running against Marine Le Pen in 2027?
I think all of these discussions is fiction. The next elections is in 2027. We're in 2024, and I think French people want me to commit today on 2024 issues and are not really interested in what will happen in 3 years. We have a president, Emmanuel Macron. We are very lucky in France to have him as a president, and I'm only committed on my mission as Prime Minister.
You mentioned the war in Europe. I want to talk, if I can, about what is happening in Ukraine, because Russia is gaining territory in Ukraine as Ukraine complains about slow delivery of aid from Western nations, in particular the United States. Poland's Prime Minister says that Europe is in a pre-war era and the continent is not ready. Do you agree with that assessment from Donald Tusk?
We are seeing the return of war on the European continent. And 2 years ago, when the war began and the Russian aggression began, many people thought that Ukraine could not resist. And since 2 years, we've seen Ukraine resisting. And Ukraine is resisting because Ukrainians are very brave, their president is very brave, but also because we support them as France and as the European Union. France gave 7 billion euros of military support to Ukraine. So we will keep on supporting Ukraine to resist against Russia, because after Ukraine, it's the European Union. And many European Union countries, and you mentioned Poland, are scared about what could come next. So what we are fighting for is Ukraine's freedom, but it's also our values and the people's and the country's sovereignty and the European Union's value.
But are we fighting for it hard enough and fast enough? I spoke with a representative of the Estonian Foreign Ministry the other day, and we talked about how Russia essentially has an economy the size of Canada's, roughly the size of Spain's, and yet it is holding on against the collective might of all the Western democracies who are part of this alliance, who should be able to overcome this, but domestic political issues in particular are stopping the flow at the pace Ukraine is asking for.
All the Russian economy is now turned on the war. But Ukraine is resisting because we are supporting Ukraine. And as France, as the European Union, with allies such as Canada, who has a decisive support also for Ukraine, they are resisting. But it's true that we need to do more. We need to do even more. That's why we had a very important meeting in Paris, with leaders from all over the world, and Canada was represented at that meeting. And that's why also the NATO summit on July in Washington will be very important to keep on increasing our support for Ukraine, because Russia can't win this war.
The NATO summit in July, it's clear where President Joe Biden stands in his support of NATO and his support of Ukraine. It's also clear, arguably, where Donald Trump stands. And less than a year from now, he could be the U.S. president. He opposes U.S. aid in Ukraine. He has questioned the very foundational principles of collective defense of NATO. How is France preparing for a possible Trump presidency?
I don't want to meddle in the U.S. internal politics and election, but what I will tell you as the French Prime Minister and as a European is that I don't want France and the EU's security to depend on others. We need to depend mostly on ourselves. We need a second lifeguard. We have NATO, but we also need to increase even more our defense policy in the EU to have this other lifeguard. So I don't want our security, I don't want our choices, I don't want our ability to support Ukraine to depend on elections over the Atlantic.
Are you worried, though, that President Trump could abandon NATO, he could abandon Europe if Russian hostilities escalate? Because he has sent clear signals going back to his first trip to Brussels as president that he's not happy with the way NATO is functioning.
Again, I don't want to meddle in these elections, but I say that we need to also handle ourselves in the EU. And that's the project from the President Macron, since 2017. He had a very important speech at the Sorbonne saying that we need a European sovereignty and we need a European defense budget and a European defense policy. And that's what we did the last years, and I think we have many other things to do ahead.
On issues of military spending, we have seen a significant increase in spending from European members of NATO. Germany obviously comes to mind. France is just below the 2% spending target. I think you're at 1.9. You're basically there. But Canada is only at about 1.3%. The government announced a plan this week to get it closer to 1.75, 1.76%, but not until the end of this decade. Is Canada doing enough on defense, given the collective challenge that NATO is facing, from your view?
I think I don't have to comment on that, but what I will say, I will say that the most important thing first is being present in multilateral assemblies, because as adults, we have first to do diplomacy and to try to talk to each other. Then the situation we're seeing in Ukraine today shows that we need to prepare ourselves for any situation. Right. That's why we decided in France to increase a lot our defense budget. Since between the President Macron's election in 2017 and the end of his second term in 2027, we will have doubled the defense budget in France. So we are at the 2%. I saw that Canada presented and gave public a defense plan, increasing their defense spending. And what I want to say is that France, I think, is a reliable partner for Canada to increase its defense mechanisms, as well as for strategic and industrial support.
On that, one of the ideas, the aspirations in Canada's defense plan that they rolled out is the acquisition of new submarines, in particular to deal with Arctic sovereignty and patrolling, as the ice pack melts. Is France part of that? Are there conversations between Canada and France about acquiring French-made submarines?
You know, we have a very strong defense industry in France with, for instance, Naval Group and other industrial giants regarding the defense industry. And I know that there are talks between these companies and many countries. You know, we had some announcements from the Netherlands a few weeks ago. So that's why I said that I think we can be a very reliable partner for Canada on these issues.
One last issue to speak with you about, sir, is the Israel-Hamas war. France, Canada, other countries have called for a ceasefire there and certainly an increase in humanitarian aid. We watch what's happening in the United States, where there seems to be an increasing frustration with the way Benjamin Netanyahu and his military and government are conducting this war. But so far, U.S. support hasn't come with conditions, at least not in terms of military aid and support. Can you get to a ceasefire without more pressure from the United States, given the dynamic at play in Israel and in Gaza right now?
First, I want to remember that this dramatic situation in Gaza comes from the terrorist attack from Hamas on Israelis. Mm-hmm. And it's very important to remember that there was on October 7th a terrible terrorist attack, and Israel decided to fight back. Also for hostages, we still have 3 hostages, French hostages in Gaza right now, and we really want to get them home. The second thing is that the situation today in Gaza is dramatic and quite unbearable at some points. And so we need a ceasefire in order to end this spiral of violence. There are many debates in many countries and also in the US. We saw a few weeks ago that a resolution from the Security Council in the UN was voted calling for a ceasefire. So we're seeing also the US supporting and moving for a ceasefire.
Okay, with just as a final question, with everything that is happening in Europe, everything that's happening in the Middle East, there is an insecurity happening globally. Your country's about to host the Olympics in just a few months. I know the recent attacks in Moscow. This was an organization, this ISIS group, that your government has said was thwarted from launching attacks on French soil in recent months. How concerned are you about the security situation as you get ready to welcome the world to host the Olympics? You know,
we've been preparing these Olympics and Paralympics games for years now, and it will be a very important gathering around our values and the Olympic values. And security is our top priority for the organization of these games in the summer in Paris. And we've been working a lot on the security issues. We have many partners around the EU also supporting us on that. And so I'm quite confident about what we've been doing to handle the security during these Olympic Games.
Prime Minister, it was very good to meet you. Thank you for coming in today. Enjoy your trip to Canada. We've also learned that French President Emmanuel Macron is also coming to Canada. According to our colleagues at Radio-Canada, Macron is planning to visit this July. His trip will include a stop in the Maritimes. Macron has not been to Canada since 2018, when Prime Minister Justin Trudeau hosted the G7 summit in Charlevoix, Quebec.